The day Nora Voss turned 20, she owned nothing but a backpack, a broken zipper on her left boot, and a library card she had not used in 6 months because she no longer had an address to put on the renewal form. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had been sleeping in the women's shelter on Caldwell Street for 11 weeks by then, tucked into a cot between a woman named Dolores who snored like a freight train and a teenage girl named Priya who cried quietly each night until she didn't. Nora had stopped counting the nights early on. Counting made it real in a way she couldn't afford. Nobody plans to be homeless at 20. That's the thing people don't understand when they look at someone like Nora. When they glance at the backpack and the worn boots and the coat that's one season too thin, and they make their silent calculations. They assume a story full of bad choices, recklessness, maybe addiction. They don't picture the sequence of ordinary disasters that can reduce a careful, quiet, hard-working person to nothing. Nora's sequence had been this: a mother who died of a cardiac event when Nora was 17, a landlord who wouldn't extend credit past 60 days, a part-time job at a grocery store that cut her hours when she missed a shift to attend the funeral, a cousin who offered her a couch for 3 months and then moved his girlfriend in, a string of rooms in shared apartments that came and went as roommates changed cities, jobs, relationships. And then, at 19 and a half, the last room gone and the shelter the only thing between her and February in a city that got cold enough to kill you if you let it. She was not a tragic figure in her own mind. She was angry. Quietly, persistently, bone-deep angry. The kind of anger that doesn't flame up and burn out, but instead burns low and steady like a coal, keeping you warm when nothing else does. She worked 2 jobs in those shelter months. Mornings at a bakery on 4th Street, 5 to 11, hauling flour sacks and wiping down stainless counters and learning to make the kind of croissants that people drove across town for. Afternoons and evenings, she cleaned offices downtown, vacuuming carpets in rooms where she could see through the floor-to-ceiling glass that the city was beautiful at night if you had somewhere warm to watch it from. She saved everything she could. The shelter allowed her to store a small lockbox in the office. She put her cash in there every Friday, counted it every Sunday, and watched the number grow with the patience of someone who understood that patience was the only currency she had left. $712. That's what she had the morning she walked past the municipal auction office on Dern Avenue and saw the notice taped to the inside of the window. The paper was slightly crooked, printed in the plain black font that city offices used for everything from parking violations to death notices, which meant it demanded the same careful attention one gives to things that don't look important but are. Surplus property auction, City of Halverton, Lot 7, former Wickfield Clocktower, 14, Garnet Lane. Minimum bid, $400. Property sold ASIS. No warranties express or implied. Viewing by appointment only. Auction date, March 14th. Nora stood on the sidewalk and read it twice. Then she stood there a third time, not reading, just thinking. She had seen the Wickfield Clocktower. Everyone in Halverton had seen it. It sat at the far end of Garnet Lane like a relic from a different century, which it was, built in 1887 according to the rusted plaque on its iron gate. For stories of blackened limestone with a clock face on each of its 4 sides, the hands long since frozen at 11 minutes past 3. The tower had been decommissioned by the city in 1994 when the mechanisms failed, and the repair estimate came back at a number the city council described as fiscally irresponsible. For 30 years it had sat there behind its gate, gathering moss and pigeons, its windows dark, its bells silent, the subject of mild local legend and the occasional teenage dare. It was, by any ordinary measurement, worthless. The auction notice said as much with its careful disclaimer language and its $400 minimum bid, a price so low it was almost an insult to the property, a price that said even the city had given up on it. Nora stood there on the sidewalk thinking about $400. She had $712. The math was not complicated. What was complicated was everything else. She had no construction experience, no knowledge of what it would cost to make a building livable, no legal understanding of what she could or couldn't do with a decommissioned tower on a street corner in a city that hadn't touched it in 30 years. She was 20 years old, homeless, and standing outside a government office in a coat that was 1 season too thin. She made the appointment for the viewing. The city employee who met her at the gate was a man named Gerald, late 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the expression of someone who had spent many years managing expectations. He unlocked the iron gate with a key from a large ring and swung it open with a sound like something finally exhaling. "You understand this is sold as is," he said, not unkindly. "City takes no responsibility for the structural condition. You'd want to get an engineer in here before you make any decisions." "I understand," Nora said. Gerald walked her through the ground floor first. It was a single circular room, the stone walls thick enough to swallow sound. The floor original wood that had warped and buckled in places but held. There was no electricity. There had been a small oil heater at some point, Gerald explained, the circular marks still visible on the floor. The ceiling was high, the windows narrow and deep-set, the kind designed to keep out cold rather than admit light. The room smelled of dust and old stone and something faintly sweet that Nora couldn't identify. The second and third floors were accessed by an iron spiral staircase bolted to the wall, narrow and steep. Both floors were roughly the same, unfinished spaces used at various points in the tower's history for storage, each with two small windows that looked out at different angles across the city. From the third floor, Nora could see the river. Gerald showed her the staircase that led to the fourth floor, the bell room, then stopped. "I wouldn't go up there," he said. "Structurally, it's the least inspected part. The bell's still there, what's left of it. The floor's questionable." "How questionable?" The report from 1994 said it needed immediate reinforcement. Nobody did the reinforcement. He said this without particular alarm, the same way he'd said everything else, the way a person says things they've said many times before. Nora looked up the staircase into the darkness above. "I'll look from the doorway," she said. Gerald shrugged and let her. She stood in the doorway of the bell room and let her eyes adjust. The room was circular like all the others, but larger somehow. The ceiling open above to the wooden framework that supported the bell mechanism, or what remained of it. The bell itself hung in the center, much smaller than she'd imagined, dull bronze, green-streaked with decades of oxidation, suspended by chains that looked older than anyone alive. The floor around it was piled with pigeon dross and old leaves, and the dried remains of things that had crept in through the gaps in the louvers over the decades. In the dim light coming through those narrow wooden slats, the room looked like the inside of something that had been sleeping a very long time. Nora looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then she walked back down. "I'd like to bid," she said to Gerald. He blinked at her. Then he looked around, as if confirming that she was indeed talking about this specific building. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Can I ask why?" Nora thought about that for a moment. "Because nobody else wants it," she said, which was true, and because at $400 it's the only thing I can afford, which was also true but felt less important to say out loud. Gerald wrote her name on the form with the careful slowness of a man who was not sure he was doing her a favor. She won the auction with a bid of $420. There were two other bidders. One was a property developer who'd come to look at a different lot and bid on hers almost as an afterthought, dropping out at $350 when he seemed to remember why he hadn't been interested in the first place. The other was a man in his 70s named Corbett Hale who bid $400 and then stared at Nora when she raised him, held the stare for a long moment, and shook his head. She became the legal owner of 14 Garnet Lane on March 14th, a Tuesday, standing in a municipal office in a coat one season too thin, with $292 left in her lockbox, and the kind of feeling in her chest that was either a terrible mistake or the beginning of something she didn't have the words for yet. She went back to the shelter that night and lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things she did not know. She did not know structural engineering. She did not know plumbing or electrical or zoning law. She did not know what 4 stories of 1887 limestone required in the way of maintenance, repair, or permits. She did not know if the floor on the 4th level would hold a grown person's weight or collapse the moment someone stepped onto it. She did not know why there was a smell on the ground floor that was almost sweet, almost familiar, almost like something she couldn't quite name. What she knew was that she owned a building. For the first time in her life, she owned something that couldn't be taken back in 60 days. She was at the tower by 7 the next morning. The city had given her a key to the gate, a single old iron key that fit the lock with the satisfying certainty of something made well and made to last. She let herself in and stood in the ground floor room and turned slowly, taking stock. The warped floor was the first thing. She tested boards with careful pressure, found the ones that gave too much, mapped them in her mind. About 60% of the floor was solid. The other 40% would need to come up, the joists examined, possibly replaced. She had no money to hire anyone for this. She made a note. The walls were stone, which meant they were the most sound element of the building. Stone in good condition, mostly. There were cracks in the mortar in a few places near the north-facing window, where water had gotten in and expanded through freeze-thaw cycles over decades. She traced them with her fingers. Manageable, she thought, though she didn't entirely know what she meant by that yet. She spent 4 hours on the ground floor that first morning. She had a notepad she'd bought for $1 at the shelter's supply closet, and she filled 3 pages with observations. What needed immediate attention? What could wait? What she needed to learn before she could make any decisions at all. At noon, she walked 6 blocks to the public library, which was warm and quiet in the way that public libraries always are, like they've been specifically designed to receive people who need exactly what they're offering. She found books on building repair, on stone, masonry, on the specific requirements of pre-1900 structures. She checked out 4 of them with her library card and walked back to the tower and sat on the least warped section of floor and read until the light through the narrow windows went gold and then gray and then dark. She did this every day for the first 2 weeks. Mornings at the tower learning what she had. Afternoons at the library learning what she needed to know. Evenings at the bakery and the office building, working, saving, storing money in the lockbox on Sundays. The Dolores in the cot next to hers at the shelter said, "Girl, what are you doing with yourself every day? You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I own a building," Nora said. Dolores looked at her for a moment. "What kind of building?" "A clock tower." Another long look. "Does it work? The clock?" "No." "Does anything work?" "Not yet." Dolores thought about this. "Okay," she said, with the particular respect of someone who has survived enough to recognize determination when she sees it. "Okay then." The library books introduced her to 2 concepts that changed everything about how she thought about the tower. The first was the difference between structural integrity and cosmetic condition. The building looked bad, dirty, neglected, its stone darkened by decades of city grime, its windows clouded, its floor damaged, its clock frozen. But dirty and damaged were not the same as unsound. Stone walls 36 inches thick didn't fail in 30 years of neglect. They endured. The cosmetic problems were real, but they were problems a person with time and will could solve, even without money, even without experience, if they were willing to learn. The second concept was adaptive reuse. Old buildings, especially commercial ones, had been converted into living spaces for decades. An 1887 clock tower was not beyond imagination as a home, as a studio, as something livable and beautiful. The narrow windows and the thick walls that made it cold in one season made it cool and quiet in another. The circular rooms that seemed strange were in fact unusual and therefore, to the right person, extraordinary. She began to think of the tower not as what it had been, but as what it could become. This required a shift in perception that didn't happen all at once, but crept up on her over those first weeks, arriving in pieces. The way the morning light came through the east window of the second floor and hit the stone at an angle that made it look like amber. The way the iron spiral staircase, narrow and steep and a little terrifying, was also genuinely beautiful, the kind of craftsmanship that nobody built anymore. The way the city was visible from the third-floor window in a way that made you feel like you were watching it from somewhere that had always been there and always would be, patient and permanent and unimpressed. She told nobody about this shift. She was not yet in a position to explain it to anyone without it sounding like delusion. In the 3rd week, a man named Fletcher stopped outside the gate while she was sitting on the ground floor steps with a book on masonry repair. He was maybe 60, gray at the temples, wearing work clothes that had seen serious use. He had a folding ruler sticking out of his front pocket the way other people carried pens. "You bought this place?" he said through the gate. "Yes," Nora said. "For what?" "To live in. Eventually." He looked at the tower the way Gerald had looked at her when she said she wanted to bid, with the patient skepticism of someone who has seen many things not work out. "I live on the next block," he said. "Watched this building for 20 years. Never thought anyone would actually buy it." Here I am, Nora said. He was quiet for a moment. I was a contractor. Retired 4 years ago. You need someone to look at that 4th floor before you go up there. I know, Nora said. I don't have money to hire anyone right now. Fletcher Osei looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the gate, which she hadn't locked because she was inside it, and walked up the steps and held out his hand. Fletcher, he said. Nora, I'll take a look for free. I'm bored, and this building interests me. He spent 2 hours going through the tower that afternoon, starting from the ground and working up. He tested floors with the practiced pressure of someone who could read a building the way other people read faces. He checked the mortar in the walls with a tool from the small kit he'd gone home to get, tapped on stones, examined the iron staircase with his hands more than his eyes. At the 4th floor landing, he looked at her. You sure you want to go up here? Not if you tell me not to, she said. He considered. It needs work. It's not going to collapse today, but I wouldn't put weight on the center near the bell without reinforcing first. The edges are better. He demonstrated by stepping onto the outer ring of the floor, close to the walls, testing with each step, testing. The boards held. Nora followed him, staying near the wall as he'd shown her, and stepped into the bell room for the first time. The smell hit her before anything else. That faint sweetness she'd noticed on the ground floor was stronger here, layered with the heavy cool of old stone and the green-sharp edge of oxidized bronze from the bell. She stood just inside the doorway and breathed it in, trying to identify it. Not food, not flowers. Something older, something that came from the room itself. The bell was larger than it had looked from the doorway below. Up close, suspended on its chains in the center of the room, it was impressive even in its silence. Maybe 4 feet tall, its surface mottled green and bronze, its crown fitted with an iron bracket that connected to the mechanism above, or what remained. Of the mechanism, the wooden framework largely intact, some of the metalwork corroded but structurally present. That bell is probably worth something, Fletcher said, looking up at it. Old bronze, decent size. Foundry mark might tell you more. Nora wasn't looking at the bell. She was looking at the wall. The bell room was circular, like all the others, but around its circumference, at about waist height, there ran a continuous wooden panel, maybe 18 inches tall, fitted against the stone with the precision of something installed deliberately rather than improvised. It was old, the same age as everything else in the room, dark with decades, but intact. Nora walked the perimeter slowly, running her hand along it. What's this? She said. Fletcher looked where she was pointing. He walked over, careful near the center, staying at the walls. He crouched and looked at the panel, tapped it with his knuckle. The sound was hollow. Not wall hollow, the way old panels sounded when they were just decorative, but hollow the way a box is hollow. The way a container is hollow. Nora and Fletcher looked at each other. That, Fletcher said, slowly, is not decorative paneling. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The panel ran the full circumference of the room, unbroken, attached to the stone wall beneath with iron pins that were original to the building. She could tell by the oxidation pattern, by the way the stone had darkened in a circle around each one over a century or more of contact. Whatever this panel was, whoever had installed it, they had done so when the tower was being built or very soon after. Fletcher got down on one knee and examined the lower edge, pulling a small flashlight from his kit and running it along the seam where the panel met the floor. He found something and went still. Come look at this, he said. Nora crouched beside him. At the base of the panel, about 8 inches in from the east-facing wall, there was a seam in the wood that was not like the others. The other seams were fixed, joint and peg construction, the kind that didn't move. This seam was different. The grain of the wood was interrupted. There was a slight gap, just visible in the flashlight beam, that ran vertically from floor to panel top, and at its center, about midway up, a shallow depression the size of a thumb. That, Fletcher said, is a latch. Nora looked at it. The depression was smooth from something that might have been used a long time ago, the edges worn in the specific way that things get worn when hands have touched them repeatedly. She pressed her thumb into it and felt a mechanism that was old and stiff, but not locked, not sealed, not rusted shut. She pressed harder. Something moved. The section of panel, maybe 3 feet wide, swung inward on hinges that groaned with the memory of movement, and behind it was darkness. And from the darkness came the sweetness, stronger now, clear and unmistakable. Nora recognized it. Old paper, aged paper, the kind that had been sealed away from air long enough to develop that particular smell, the smell of a library room that hasn't been opened, the smell of a letter kept in a drawer for decades, the smell of things written down and put away. Fletcher turned his flashlight into the space behind the panel. The alcove was deep, running back into the wall by about 4 feet, which was impossible given what she knew about the stone exterior, except that the walls at the base of the tower were nearly 4 feet thick, which she had read about in the library books, the foundation walls of 1880s towers built for permanence and weight. The alcove was built into the wall itself, a deliberate cavity, lined with wood on all sides to control moisture, sealed by the panel with a precision that had held for over a century. Inside the alcove were shelves, 3 of them, wooden, fitted to the cavity's dimensions. And on the shelves were objects. Nora sat back on her heels, and for a long moment, she did not move. There were boxes, small ones, fitted with hinged lids, the kind made for storage, maybe a dozen of them arranged in 2 rows on the lower shelves. Above them, a leather satchel, cracked with age but intact, its buckle still clasped. And at the top, propped against the back wall of the alcove in a protective wooden frame, a painting. Even in the dim light of a single flashlight in a room that hadn't been opened in decades, the painting was unmistakably made by someone who knew what they were doing. A landscape, oil on canvas, colors still vivid under a layer of age-dimming, blues and greens and golds that even through 30 or 40 or 60 years of sealed darkness had not lost their intent. Fletcher said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Nora." "I see it," she said. "What do you want to do?" She thought about that. About opening the boxes right now, here in this half-dark room with a questionable floor and no power and a retired contractor who had wandered in off the street. About what it meant that these things existed in this room, in this building that she now owned. "I want to understand what I'm looking at," she said, "before I do anything else." She was careful. That was the thing about Nora, that quality that had kept her alive through everything that had come before. She was careful. She didn't panic. She didn't grab. She thought. She pulled the lever latch closed so the panel rested as it had been, and she walked back down the spiral staircase, and she sat on the least warped section of the ground floor, and she told Fletcher everything she had seen and heard and felt, and she asked him one question. Who built this tower? He knew, as it turned out, some of it. The way longtime neighborhood residents accumulate local knowledge, the way houses accumulate paint, layer on layer. The tower had been built by a man named Aldous Wickfield, he said, which she had known from the plaque on the gate. But Fletcher knew more. Aldous Wickfield had been a watchmaker, originally, from somewhere in Central Europe, who had arrived in Halverton in the 1870s and made a modest fortune in precision instruments. The clock tower had been both his workshop and his statement, a man who spent his life making things that measured time, building something that told time to the whole city. He died in 1921, leaving the tower to the city in his will with a stipulation that it keep the clock running in perpetuity. The city had honored the stipulation for 73 years before the mechanisms failed, and the repair cost made the council look for language in the original bequest that might release them from the obligation. They'd found it. They always did. But Fletcher knew something else, something that a neighbor 2 streets over had mentioned once, years ago, the kind of thing that gets said in passing and half forgotten. Aldous Wickfield had been, in his later years, a collector. Not in any public way, not in any way that had made it into the newspaper archives or the museum catalogs. A quiet collector, the kind who bought privately and kept things privately and told almost nobody. Nora sat with this for a long time. Then she went back to the library. She spent a week there, beyond her usual afternoon visits, spending the evenings after her work shifts at the research desk, learning to use databases that the reference librarian, a patient woman named Cassandra, showed her how to access. She searched for Aldous Wickfield in historical records, in city directories from the 1880s through 1920, in newspaper archives, digitized and searchable, in estate records that the County Historical Society had uploaded in pieces over years. What she found was a shadow of a man, present in records the way quiet people are, noted when unavoidable, absent otherwise. He had paid his taxes. He had been mentioned once in a 1902 newspaper as a donor to a civic improvement fund. His estate, such as it was formally recorded, had consisted of the tower, some workshop equipment, and a modest bank account. The estate had passed to the city as he'd specified, but an estate record was only what was declared. What was declared was only what a man chose to declare. She found one more thing. In the archives of a European art dealer that had been digitized by a university as part of a historical commerce project, she found a single receipt, dated 1909, for the purchase of a landscape oil painting described as School of the Barbizon, Provenance Private Collection, France. The buyer's name on the receipt was listed as A. Wickfield, Halverton, USA. She printed the receipt on the library printer, 10 cents, and folded it, and put it in her coat pocket, and walked back to the tower in the November cold, and stood outside the gate, and looked up at the 4 frozen clock faces, and thought about a watchmaker from Central Europe who had built a tower to measure time, and quietly filled its highest room with things he wanted to keep. She made another appointment. Not with the city this time. With the university. Halverton had a state university with an art history department. She found the faculty page and looked for someone who studied historical collections, 19th and early 20th century. She found a professor named Dr. Amara Lindt, whose research focus was listed as Private Collecting and Art Circulation in the American Northeast, 1870 to 1930. She sent an email from her phone, short and careful, telling almost nothing but enough. She had acquired an old building. She had found some objects in a sealed alcove. She was trying to understand their origin and age. She was not trying to sell anything. She was trying to understand what she had. Dr. Lindt wrote back in 48 hours. She was interested. She could come on Thursday. Nora spent the 2 days before Thursday reinforcing the floor of the bell room as much as she was able, following instructions she'd found in one of the library books and supplemented by advice from Fletcher, who came by on Tuesday and helped her brace the worst of the boards near the center without disturbing the perimeter, which was solid enough. They worked quietly and carefully, and when they were done, the room was still a room that needed proper professional work, but it was a room that would hold the weight of 2 careful adults moving near the walls. She didn't open the alcove again before Thursday. She wanted to open it once, with someone who could tell her what she was seeing. She wanted the first real look to count. Dr. Amara Lindt was younger than Nora had expected, early 40s maybe, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she spent time in places that weren't climate-controlled offices. She arrived at 9 in the morning with a shoulder bag and a case of equipment, and she stood outside the gate and looked at the tower for a long moment before she said anything. "I've driven past this building 100 times," she said. "I never stopped." "Nobody did," Nora said. "That's why I could afford it." Dr. Lindt looked at her with something that might have been reassessment. Then she followed her inside. They went through the lower floors first, Nora giving context as they climbed, explaining what she'd found in the records, the Wickfield history, the receipt from the European dealer. Dr. Lindt listened and asked quiet questions and touched the walls with the same kind of reading attention that Fletcher used, though her fluency was different, less structural, more historical. At the 4th floor, Nora showed her the staircase and explained the floor condition. Dr. Lindt had worn flat-soled shoes without being asked, which told Nora something about what kind of professional she was. They entered the bell room together, close to the walls. Dr. Lindt looked at the bell first, spending a minute with her flashlight on the foundry mark, photographing it. 19th century, she said. Probably 1880s. I can have this dated properly. Then she looked at the continuous wooden panel and was quiet. Nora showed her the latch. Dr. Lindt crouched and examined it without touching, then looked at Nora. "You found this?" "Yes." "And you haven't opened it since?" "No." Dr. Lindt was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said, and her voice was different now, lower, careful, the voice of someone in the presence of something that deserved care. "Let's open it." The mechanism moved more easily the second time, as if the first time had loosened something. The panel swung inward, and the smell came out again. Old paper and sealed air and the accumulated presence of things kept long and carefully. Dr. Lindt turned her flashlight into the alcove. She did not move for a full 30 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was very controlled. "I need to photograph everything before we touch anything. I need you to understand that what we do in the next hour matters for how these objects can be understood and authenticated going forward. Can you give me time to do this properly? Yes, Nora said. Dr. Lindt spent 40 minutes photographing the alcove as a whole, each shelf, each object in situ, the hinges, the latch, the wood lining, the stone behind it. She photographed the painting in the frame at the top. She photographed the leather satchel without opening it. She photographed each of the boxes without opening them. She worked in silence, thorough and steady, and Nora stood near the wall and watched and waited. When she was done, she turned to Nora. "The painting," she said. "I can't tell you what it's worth standing here in a flashlight beam. But the technique, the palette, the canvas preparation, what I can see of it, this is not amateur work. This is not a reproduction of something or a piece of decorative art. This is a painting made by someone with significant training and skill in the Barbizon tradition, which aligns with the receipt you found. This is potentially a significant piece." "How significant?" Nora said. Dr. Lindt paused. "That depends on attribution, on provenance, on authentication, all of which take time. But I've been studying private collections from this period for 15 years, and I have not, in person, seen a painting of this quality come out of a private alcove that nobody knew about." She looked at Nora directly. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I think so," Nora said. "The boxes," Dr. Lindt continued. "I don't know what's in them. The satchel I don't know. The painting I have a feeling about. But I've learned not to trust feelings until the work is done." She closed the alcove panel carefully. "I'd like to bring a colleague, a conservator. I'd like to come back and do this properly, with proper lighting, with proper handling materials. Can you agree to not opening anything until then?" Nora thought about the boxes, about what might be in them, about the leather satchel, its buckle still clasped after however many decades, about the painting in its wooden frame. "How long?" she said. "1 week," Dr. Lindt said. "I can have everything arranged in 1 week." "Okay," Nora said. They walked back down the spiral staircase together and out through the gate into the November cold. Dr. Lindt stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the clock faces, stopped at 3:11. "Why did you buy this building?" she said. Nora gave her the same answer she'd given Gerald. "Because nobody else wanted it." Dr. Lindt looked at her. "No," she said slowly. "I don't think that's all of it." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed something that was mine. Something that couldn't be taken back." Dr. Lindt nodded slowly. "And now you might have quite a lot more than that." She said it carefully, not promising, not inflating, but the words landed in Nora's chest like something with weight. She watched Dr. Lindt walk to her car and drive away, and then she stood alone on the sidewalk outside the gate of the building she owned. Quite a lot more than that. She went back to the shelter that night. She ate the dinner they served, chicken and rice, sitting at the long table with Dolores and Priya and the dozen other women who were here, because here was where they were. She listened to the conversations around her, complaints about the cold, plans for tomorrow, the particular texture of lives lived in the narrow margin between okay and not okay. She didn't tell anyone what had happened that day. She wasn't ready. She didn't have the words yet for what she was feeling, which was something close to terror and something close to hope, and underneath both of them, that same low coal heat of anger transformed into something she was only starting to recognize. She lay on her cot that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about Aldous Wickfield, a watchmaker who built a tower, who bought a painting in 1909 from a European dealer and never told anyone, who died in 1921 and left everything to the city and maybe left more than the city knew, who had sealed something in the highest room of the building he built with his own hands and his own money and then died and taken the secret with him. She thought about the smell of old paper, about the hollow sound of Fletcher's knuckle on the wooden panel, about Dr. Lindt's controlled voice saying this is not amateur work. She thought about $420 and a lockbox in the shelter office and a library card and a building at the end of Garnet Lane. She was 20 years old. She was sleeping on a shelter cot. She had found something in a bell room that nobody had opened in 100 years, and she did not yet know what it was, and the not knowing was the most alive she had felt in longer than she could remember. Outside, the city went about its business, indifferent and vast. The clock tower stood at the end of Garnet Lane with its 4 frozen faces, marking a time that had stopped in 1994, measuring nothing, telling no one anything. Nora closed her eyes. She breathed. She waited. The week that followed was the longest of her life. which was saying something. She went to the tower every morning, as she had before, but now the quality of her time there changed. She had been learning it methodically, practically, floor by floor, and wall by wall. Now she moved through it with a different kind of attention, the way you move through a place when you understand it might matter, when you're trying to see it as what it was before it became what it is. She touched the stone walls and thought about hands that had laid them. She stood on the iron staircase and thought about feet that had climbed it. She sat in the second-floor room and watched the morning light come through the east window and do what it did to the stone, and tried to imagine a watchmaker from Central Europe standing in this same light over 100 years ago, thinking about time. She went back to the library and looked for more about Aldous Wickfield. She found a short paragraph in a book about Halverton's architectural history, published in 1978, that mentioned the tower in the context of late Victorian commercial construction. The paragraph said Wickfield was a private man of considerable self-sufficiency, known in the trade for his precision and in the neighborhood for his silence. The author of the paragraph had probably thought they were being neutral. Nora read it as a description of someone who had learned that what you kept to yourself stayed yours. She found one other thing. In a digitized city directory from 1915, a listing for a business on Garnet Lane, Wickfield Precision Instruments, hours by appointment. And beside it, in the same column, a listing she hadn't seen in the earlier directories. Wickfield Private Gallery, not open to the public. Not open to the public. She sat with that for a long time in the library, the heating vent above her head making its steady sound, the other patrons moving around her with their own business. A private gallery. Not a collection stored out of sight in an alcove, but a gallery, something with intention, something with a name. Not open to the public because it wasn't for the public. It was for him. She thought about what a man does with a private gallery in 1915 in a city that won't see it. He builds it for himself. He builds it because he believes in what he's keeping. He builds it with the same hands and the same precision he puts into the instruments he's known for, the ones that measure time down to the second, the ones that never lose what they're tracking. He builds it because a watchmaker understands better than most that the thing about time is not that it passes, but that it keeps passing, and the only things that outlast it are the things somebody decided were worth keeping. Aldous Wickfield had decided something was worth keeping. He had sealed it in the highest room of the building he loved, and he had died, and the city had taken the building and never looked, and the tower had stood for 100 more years telling nothing to no one. Until a homeless 20-year-old bought it for $420 because it was the only thing she could afford. Dr. Lindt came back on a Thursday, as she'd said, with a colleague named Marcus Gale who was the university's objects conservator and who arrived with 2 cases of equipment and the careful manner of a person who handled irreplaceable things for a living. Fletcher was there too, not invited but not unwelcome, standing near the gate with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has decided to witness whatever happens. They went up together, Nora last, behind the others, climbing the spiral staircase with its iron treads, past the second floor and the third, up into the bell room with its dim light through the wooden louvers and its smell of old bronze and older paper. Marcus Gale spent 20 minutes examining the alcove structure before he opened anything, running his fingers along the lining wood, checking the humidity with a small meter from his case, shining a narrow beam at the objects inside with the concentrated attention of someone reading. He murmured occasionally to Dr. Lindt, technical things Nora could only partly follow. Then he began to work. He opened the satchel first. It was leather, good leather, the kind made to last, and it had lasted. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that was old but had done its job, were papers, documents, folded letters, some handwritten, some typed on early typewriter keys, the letters faded but legible. Receipts. A ledger, small and precise, its columns filled with dates and figures and abbreviations that weren't immediately clear. Marcus held the ledger under his light and read quietly. Dr. Lindt read over his shoulder. They were quiet for a long time. Then Dr. Lindt said, "These are acquisition records." Nora looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means Wickfield kept a record of everything he bought. What it was, where he got it, what he paid. The dates run from 1893 to 1919. She turned a page carefully. "It's comprehensive. It's a catalog." "Of what's in the boxes," Nora said. "Among other things," Dr. Lindt said quietly. "Among other things." Marcus moved to the boxes. He opened them one by one. methodically, and Nora stood near the wall and watched and did not speak. Each box opened to something different. Coins, some in protective sleeves, some loose, their surfaces green with age and almost certainly very old. Small objects wrapped in cloth, unwrapped slowly and carefully to reveal things she didn't have names for yet. Carved pieces, small sculptures, what looked like a miniature manuscript cover in dark leather. A roll of papers that turned out, when opened flat with careful hands, to be architectural drawings in an old style she didn't recognize. And finally, at the bottom of the last box on the lowest shelf, something wrapped more carefully than the rest, in multiple layers of cloth, in what turned out to be an inner sleeve of treated paper. Marcus unwrapped it slowly, with the particular focus of someone who already suspects what they're going to find. It was a small book, bound in dark leather, its pages thick with age, handwritten throughout in a script she couldn't read. Dr. Lindt looked at it for a long moment without touching it, and her expression was the most controlled Nora had seen it. "Marcus," she said. "I see it," he said. A silence. "What is it?" Nora said. Dr. Lindt turned to her. Her voice was very even. "It needs proper examination. Proper dating. There are people who specialize in documents like this. I want to be careful about what I say before the work is done." "Tell me what you think," Nora said. Dr. Lindt was quiet for a moment. "The script, the vellum, the binding style. If this is what it looks like, if the dating confirms what I'm seeing, then this is a manuscript. Medieval. Possibly illuminated, though I can't be certain without unfolding more pages, which I won't do here." She paused. Manuscripts of this age and type, authenticated and with clear provenance, are extraordinarily rare. They appear at major auction houses perhaps once or twice a decade. Nora stood in the bell room of her building, 4 stories up, surrounded by 100 years of cold stone and the smell of old paper, and felt something move through her that was not quite anything she had words for. Not joy, not yet, because she didn't know enough yet. Not fear exactly. Something larger than both. Something that had the shape of the question she had been asking for 20 years, the question she hadn't known she was asking, which was whether things could be different, whether the sequence of ordinary disasters that had reduced her to a shelter cot was the whole story, or whether there was something further, something she couldn't see from where she had been standing. From the bell room of the Wickfield Clocktower, she could see the river. Fletcher spoke from behind her, his voice quiet and rough. "What does all this mean?" he said. Dr. Lindt and Marcus looked at each other. A look that said things Nora could feel without being able to see directly. "It means," Dr. Lindt said carefully, "that we need to contact some specialists. And it means that Nora should consider speaking with a lawyer." "Why a lawyer?" Fletcher said. "Because," Dr. Lindt said, and she looked at Nora steadily, "what is in this alcove may be considerably more valuable than the building that contains it. And we need to understand what that means for her." Nora looked at the alcove, at the boxes, the painting, the satchel, the small book wrapped in its careful layers. She looked at the bell, green and bronze and silent. She looked through the louvers at the November sky, gray and cold and indifferent. She thought about $420. She thought about a library card. She thought about the smell of old paper and what it means when something has been waiting a very long time for someone to find it. She breathed. She was 20 years old. She was standing in the highest room of a building she owned, and somewhere in the boxes and the satchel and the small wrapped book, there was something that someone had decided was worth keeping. Now it was hers to understand. The lawyer's name was Petra Van, and she came recommended by the university's legal office, which Dr. Lindt had quietly contacted on Nora's behalf before asking permission, which Nora noted and filed away as something to think about later. Petra Van was in her mid-50s, with short silver hair and the particular composure of someone who had spent a career sitting across from people in the middle of the worst or the most complicated moments of their lives, and had learned to hold steady regardless of which it was. She met Nora at the tower on a Friday morning, 2 days after the second alcove opening. She came alone, without a briefcase, carrying only a yellow legal pad and a pen, which Nora respected. She walked through the building without being told to, taking her time, and when she got to the bell room she stood in the doorway and looked at the alcove panel for a long moment before she spoke. "Dr. Lindt's office sent me a summary," she said. "I want to hear it from you." So Nora told her everything. From the auction notice on the window at the municipal office to the $420 to Gerald and his reading glasses and his careful disclaimers. The library books. Fletcher and his folding ruler. The hollow knock. The smell. Dr. Lindt. Marcus. The boxes. The satchel with the ledger. The painting in its frame. The small book wrapped in treated paper that had made Dr. Lindt go quiet in a way that filled the room. Petra Van wrote on her yellow legal pad throughout. Not constantly, but selectively. The way people write when they're capturing the things that matter rather than everything. When Nora finished, Petra looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up. The first question is ownership, she said. You purchased this property from the city at a municipal surplus auction. The auction conveyed fee simple ownership of the real property, meaning the land and the building. The legal question is whether that conveyance also transferred ownership of the personal property contained within the building. Does it? Nora said. Generally, yes. When a property changes hands, items left behind by previous owners become the property of the new owner, particularly in an as-is sale with no warranties and no reserved rights. The city made no claim to any contents because, as far as anyone knew, there were no contents of significance. The previous owner, Aldous Wickfield, died in 1921. His estate was settled over a century ago. There are no surviving heirs, no outstanding claims. She paused. Based on what you've described and what Dr. Lindt's preliminary assessment indicates, it is very likely that what you found in that alcove is legally yours. The words sat in the air of the bell room. Nora breathed them in along with the smell of old paper and old bronze. Very likely, she said. Not certainly. Law rarely deals in certainties, Petra said. But the case for your ownership is strong. I'd recommend we document everything through proper legal channels. Formal inventory, witnessed, and notarized. Authentication results on record. A clear paper trail establishing that these objects were found in a sealed alcove in a property you legally purchased, in a condition that made it evident they had been there since well before your purchase, and indeed well before the city's most recent ownership. What could complicate it? Nora said. Petra was quiet for a moment. If any of the objects turn out to have been stolen, looted art, misappropriated historical artifacts. There are international databases, conventions, agreements between governments about objects that were illegally removed from their countries of origin. If anything in that alcove appears in those databases, ownership becomes significantly more complex. Nora thought about the ledger in the leather satchel. The careful columns, the dates, the figures. Aldous Wickfield documenting every acquisition. He kept records, she said. Purchase records. For everything. That helps, Petra said. That helps considerably. She made a note. Dr. Lindt mentioned a manuscript that she's having examined by a specialist. Do you know anything about its history based on the ledger? I haven't read the ledger myself. Dr. Lindt has it. I'd like a copy, Petra said. As soon as possible. They stood in the bell room for a few more minutes, Petra asking questions and Nora answering them. The bell hanging above them green and silent, the November light coming through the louvers in thin cold bars. Before they left, Petra stood in the doorway and looked back at the alcove panel, closed now, ordinary looking, its secret invisible again. One more question, Petra said. Have you told anyone else about this? Family, friends, people at the shelter where you're staying? No, Nora said. Just Fletcher, Dr. Lindt, Marcus, and now you. Keep it that way for now, Petra said. Until we have a clearer picture of what you have and what it's worth, the fewer people who know, the better. Not because you've done anything wrong. Because the moment this becomes public knowledge, it becomes significantly more complicated. Nora walked Petra back down the spiral staircase and out through the gate. She watched the silver-haired lawyer walk to her car, and she stood on the sidewalk and thought about the word significantly. She was still standing there when Fletcher came around the corner from his street, hands in his jacket pockets, moving at the pace of a man with nowhere particular to be. How'd it go, he said. She thinks it's probably mine, Nora said. Fletcher nodded slowly. Probably. She said probably. Lawyers say probably, Fletcher said, when they mean yes, but they don't want to be wrong. He went home. Nora went to work. She pulled croissants from the oven at the bakery and thought about medieval manuscripts. She vacuumed carpets in office buildings and thought about a man named Aldous who had bought things in secret and sealed them in stone and never told anyone. She got back to the shelter at 10:30, ate the apple she'd kept from lunch, and lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling until Dolores told her to stop radiating tension and go to sleep. She went to sleep. The authentication process took 6 weeks. Dr. Lindt coordinated it with the careful efficiency of someone managing a project she understood was larger than it looked, which it was. She brought in specialists one at a time, each focused on a specific category of object, each introduced to Nora before gaining access to the bell room. A numismatist from a Boston museum for the coins. A ceramics expert from the State Historical Society for 3 pieces in the boxes that turned out to be more significant than they'd looked in the flashlight beam. A paintings conservator from New York who spent an entire day with the Barbizon landscape and left looking like a person who had seen something they needed time to process. And for the manuscript, Dr. Lindt brought in a woman named Dr. Sylvia Rhodes, who flew in from a university in England and who was introduced to Nora in the ground floor of the tower with the specific gravity of someone being introduced to the custodian of something serious. Dr. Rhodes was in her 60s, gray-haired, spare in her movements, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she put on and took off with the automatic frequency of a person who lived half their life at close range with old texts. She had carried her own equipment in 2 cases, including a portable UV light and a device Nora didn't know the name of that measured things about paper she couldn't yet follow. They went up to the bell room. Dr. Rhodes looked at the alcove for a long time before she asked for the manuscript to be brought out. Marcus did the handling, the same careful unwrapping, layer by layer, until the small dark leather book was exposed on the clean surface Marcus had laid on the floor of the bell room, padded and protected. Dr. Rhodes got down on her knees. She put on her glasses. She looked. For a very long time she looked. Then she asked Marcus to open to the first page, carefully, with the folder he had for exactly this. He did. Dr. Rhodes looked at the exposed page with the UV light, with the other device, with her own eyes from a distance of about 3 inches. Then she sat back on her heels and took her glasses off and looked at Nora. "Where did you say this building was constructed?" she said. 1887, Nora said, by a watchmaker named Aldous Wickfield. "And you believe he acquired this through normal commercial channels? You have purchase documentation?" He kept a ledger. Dr. Lindt has a copy. There's an entry that we think refers to this, dated 1897, with a Paris provenance. Dr. Rhodes was quiet for a moment. Paris in 1897 was a significant moment for the European manuscript market. Collections were being dispersed from private holdings, particularly in France and Belgium. A careful buyer with resources could have acquired significant pieces through entirely legitimate channels during that period. She looked at the manuscript again. This would have been available. "What is it?" Nora said. Dr. Rhodes put her glasses back on and looked at the page for another moment. Then she looked at Nora. "I need to complete my examination before I'm prepared to make a formal statement," she said. "What I can tell you provisionally, which I would ask you to treat as preliminary and subject to revision, is that the script, the vellum composition, the binding structure, and the decorative elements visible on the first page are consistent with Flemish manuscript production in the late 14th or very early 15th century." The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed on Garnet Lane. The bell hung above them, motionless. 14th century, Nora said. "Provisionally," Dr. Rhodes said. "The examination will take several weeks. Carbon dating if the university agrees to authorize it. Comparison with known exemplars. Analysis of the pigments in the decorative work." She paused. "But provisionally, and based on my 40 years of looking at objects like this, yes. Late 14th century. Flemish. Likely a book of hours, based on the format and the partial decoration visible on the first page." "What's a book of hours worth?" Nora said. Dr. Rhodes chose her words with the precision of a person who understood that the words they chose in moments like this would be repeated. "It depends on attribution, condition, completeness, provenance. Books of hours from this period range from the tens of thousands to the tens of millions, depending on those factors." She looked at the small dark book on its padded surface. A Flemish book of hours in this condition, with clear legitimate provenance documented through a century-old acquisition record, if the dating confirms what I'm seeing, would be among the most significant manuscript discoveries in North America in the past 30 years. Dr. Lindt, standing near the wall, made a small sound that was not quite a word. Nora stood in the bell room of the building she had bought for $420 and looked at a book that was 600 years old, and the low coal heat anger that had been keeping her warm for 3 years shifted into something she didn't have a name for yet. Something larger and stranger and more frightening than anger. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a very long drop and not yet knowing if there were wings. She did not let herself feel it fully. Not yet. Dr. Rhodes had said provisionally. The examination would take weeks. She had learned enough by now to know that the space between provisionally and actually was where everything happened, and she could not afford to live in the space before the work was done. She went back to the bakery. She went back to the offices. She went back to her cot. She waited. The results arrived in pieces over the following weeks, and each piece landed in her life with the accumulated weight of something being assembled that she could not yet see the full shape of. The numismatist's report came first, a formal document in university letterhead that she read at the library reference desk because it was the only quiet place she could sit for as long as she needed. The coins were Roman. Some of them. 17 coins from the boxes. A numismatist who had spent 30 years with ancient currency identified as Roman imperial coinage from the 1st through 4th centuries, in grades of preservation ranging from good to exceptional. The exceptional ones being among the most complete examples of their specific types that the numismatist had encountered outside of museum collections. 8 more coins were medieval European, French, and Flemish, consistent with the 14th and 15th centuries. The remaining coins were early modern, 17th and 18th century, English and Dutch, collector quality. The total numismatic assessment was not a single number. It was a range, because coin values depended on market conditions and auction outcomes and the specific interest of specific buyers. But the range began at a number that made Nora read the sentence 3 times to be sure she'd read it correctly. She had. The ceramics report followed. 3 pieces that Marcus had identified as potentially significant in the initial examination turned out to be, respectively, a Tang Dynasty Chinese figure likely from the 8th century, a piece of Dutch Delftware from the 17th century in near-perfect condition, and a small Greek vessel that the ceramics expert dated to the 5th century BCE with high confidence and described in the report as an object of substantial historical and monetary significance. The painting's conservator's report was the longest. The Barbizon landscape had been cleaned, carefully, partially, enough to reveal what was underneath the accumulated dimming of decades. The conservator's report ran to 12 pages, the first 10 of which were technical, analysis of the canvas preparation and the pigment layers and the varnish history, things Nora read carefully and mostly understood. The final 2 pages were the conclusion. The painting was an original work, not a copy, not a school piece, not an attribution to a follower. Original work by a named artist, identified through signature analysis and stylistic comparison and the provenance that flowed from Wickfield's ledger back to a known dealer who had handled authenticated works by this artist in the same period. The artist's name meant something. It wasn't the most famous name from that tradition, not one that appeared in the kind of general art history books she'd found at the library, but in the specific field of 19th century French landscape painting, it was a name that appeared in auction records. A name that appeared with prices attached to it, that she read and then read again. She was sitting at the library reference desk when she finished the painting's report, and Cassandra the reference librarian came over to ask if she needed anything and stopped when she saw Nora's face. "Are you all right?" Cassandra said. "Yes," Nora said. "I think so. I'm not sure." Cassandra looked at her with the particular kindness of someone who worked in a public library and had long since stopped being surprised by the range of things that happened to people. "Can I get you some water?" she said. "Yes," Nora said. "Please." She drank the water and sat with the reports spread in front of her and tried to add up the numbers, which she couldn't do precisely because each report gave ranges rather than fixed values. But she could work with the low ends of the ranges. She could be conservative, take the most cautious number from each document and add them together and see what the floor looked like. She did this. Then she checked her arithmetic. Then she checked it again. The floor, the most conservative possible reading of the most cautious numbers in the assessments completed so far, not including the manuscript which Dr. Rhodes had not yet finished, was enough to change her life entirely. More than enough. The kind of number that, when she tried to hold it in her mind, kept slipping out, not because she was bad at numbers, but because the number was too far from everything she had known for her mind to hold it still. She folded the reports carefully, put them in the folder she had bought specifically for them, put the folder in her backpack, and walked out of the library into the December cold. She stood on the library steps and breathed. This was the moment, she understood, when some people would run. When the enormity of the thing would become too much, and they would look for the shortest path to liquid cash, to something they could hold in their hands, to certainty. She understood the impulse. She had spent 3 years with nothing certain, and the body learns from that, learns to distrust slowness, to grab what's available before it disappears. She breathed again. She walked back to the tower. It was the second week of December, cold enough for her breath to be visible, the sky the particular gray of a city winter. She let herself in through the gate and stood in the ground floor room, alone, and looked at the warped floor and the cracked mortar and the narrow windows and the iron staircase rising into the dark above. She had bought this building because it was the only thing she could afford, and because it was hers, and because nobody else wanted it. Those facts were still true. Every other fact had changed around them. The building was now the least significant thing the building contained, which was not how she had expected this to go, but she was learning that the things that changed your life rarely arrived in the shape you had been imagining. She climbed to the bell room. She stood near the wall, in her usual position, close enough to the stone to feel its cold through her coat. She looked at the alcove panel, closed and ordinary, and keeping its counsel. "All right," she said aloud. To the room, to the bell, to the century-old air. All right. She didn't know who she was talking to. It didn't matter. It was something that needed saying, and she was the only one there. She went back to the shelter and told Petra Van she needed to meet. The meeting was at Petra's office, which was the first time Nora had been in a lawyer's office, and she registered the details with the attention she'd given to everything since the tower. The books organized by category, the desk clear of everything unnecessary, the way Petra stood when Nora came in and offered her a chair and coffee, which she accepted because it was free and warm, and she was both cold and trying to practice accepting things that were offered. Nora laid the reports on Petra's desk. Petra read them without comment, page by page, with the same focused quiet she'd brought to the bell room. When she finished, she set the last one down and looked at Nora. "How are you?" she said. "I don't know," Nora said. "I keep trying to figure out what I'm supposed to feel." "There's no supposed to," Petra said. "In my experience, people feel what they feel, and what they feel is usually more complicated than anyone expects." She looked at the reports again. "This is before the manuscript assessment." "Yes." "And Dr. Rhodes's timeline?" She said another 2 to 3 weeks. Petra was quiet for a moment. "There are things we need to do before that report arrives. The formal inventory needs to be complete and properly witnessed. The legal claim documentation needs to be filed. I want a record in place before any of this becomes public, which it will, and probably sooner than either of us would choose." "Why sooner than we'd choose?" Nora said. "Because this involves multiple specialists from multiple institutions, and academic communities are small, and people talk, not maliciously necessarily, but inevitably. You've managed the circle well so far, but the manuscript specialist is from England. The painting's conservator is from New York. The numismatist is from Boston. Each of them goes back to their institution and their colleagues, and they're human beings, which means this will not stay quiet much longer." Nora thought about this. What happens when it doesn't? "Attention," Petra said simply. "Media. Institutional interest from museums, universities, possibly foreign governments, depending on what the provenance records show. People who will tell you what you should do with what you have. People who will tell you what they believe you owe them. And people who will decide, before they've met you, before they know your name or your story, that someone like you having something like this is not the natural order of things. Someone like you." Nora heard the phrase for what it was, not cruelty, just truth spoken plainly by a lawyer who had been in enough rooms to know how they worked. "You mean homeless," Nora said. "Young, female, without institutional affiliation or family wealth or the specific credentials that certain people believe should accompany the discovery of significant objects." Petra held her gaze. "None of that changes the legal reality, which is that these objects are yours, but it will shape the experience of being the person they belong to. I want you to be ready for that." Nora looked at the reports on Petra's desk, at the numbers and the ranges, at the language the specialists had used, significant, exceptional, among the most, substantial, historical, and monetary. I grew up in the foster system, she said. I've been told I don't have rights to things my whole life. I know what that looks like. Petra looked at her for a moment. Good, she said. Then you're not going into this unprepared. They spent 2 more hours going through the legal strategy, and when Nora left the office and walked back into the December cold, the city looked the same as it always had, indifferent and vast, and full of people who didn't know her name. She walked to the shelter and ate dinner and lay on her cot, and this time she felt something different, not the terror and hope combination from before, but something quieter, something more like ground. She was not unprepared. She had never been unprepared. She had simply, for a long time, been without resources, which was not the same thing. The manuscript report arrived on a Tuesday in late December. Dr. Rhodes sent it electronically, first to Petra's office as instructed, and Petra called Nora at the bakery, which she had never done before, and said, in a voice as controlled as it had been in every conversation they'd had, that she should come to the office when her shift ended. Nora left the bakery at 11 and walked to Petra's office and sat in the same chair she'd sat in before, and Petra put the printed report on the desk between them. Read the summary first, Petra said. The summary was on the first page, in the compact, precise English of academic formal writing, stripped of hedges and qualifiers. Dr. Rhodes and 2 colleagues she had brought in for verification, both named in the report with their institutional affiliations, had completed physical examination, UV analysis, carbon, 14 dating of the vellum, pigment spectroscopy on the decorative elements, and comparative analysis against 15 known exemplars. The manuscript was a Flemish book of hours. Dating of the vellum placed it between 1385 and 1410. The decorative style, examined in detail through the careful partial opening of 43 pages, was consistent with a specific atelier, a workshop, operating in Ghent in the late 14th century. Comparison with 3 known works attributed to or associated with this atelier confirmed the stylistic match with a high degree of confidence. The manuscript was complete, 213 vellum pages, fully decorated throughout with inhabited initials and border illustrations, and 12 full-page miniatures that Dr. Rhodes described, in language that was almost not academic, as among the finest examples of late medieval Flemish illumination outside of major institutional collections. The provenance chain, reconstructed from Wickfield's ledger and the Paris dealer documentation that Petra had located through further research, was clean. No record of theft, no appearance in the art loss register or any equivalent international database. A legitimate sale in Paris in 1897 to a careful private buyer who had sealed it in stone and never told anyone. Nora read the summary. Then she turned to the valuation section. Dr. Rhodes was careful with numbers, as she had been in person, providing context and caveats and ranges. But ranges had floors, and the floor of Dr. Rhodes's range for a complete, fully illuminated late 14th century Flemish book of hours with clean provenance, and the specific atelier attribution confirmed in this report was a number that Nora read, and then put the page down and looked at the ceiling and breathed for a moment. Petra waited. The full collection, Nora said. All of it together. What are we looking at? Petra had done the arithmetic. She had a page of her own, legal pad, yellow, figures in columns. She turned it around and pushed it across the desk. The total range, low end to high end, accounting for all items assessed, and the manuscript at Dr. Rhodes's stated range, was between $6 million and $14 million. The midpoint of that range, the number that sat between the most conservative and most optimistic assessments, was slightly over $9 million. Nora sat in Petra Van's office and looked at a legal pad with $9 million written in the middle of it, and understood something that she had not fully understood before, which was that the shape of her life had changed. Not might change, had changed, past tense, already, in the moment she had pressed her thumb against a latch in a dark room in a building nobody wanted. The question now was not whether her life was different. It was how she was going to live in the difference. She thought about a woman named Dolores who snored like a freight train and had looked at her with respect when she said she owned a building. She thought about Priya, who had been in the shelter when Nora arrived and was still there, 17 and quiet. She thought about the man who had looked at her across the auction room and shaken his head and walked away. She thought about Gerald at the municipal office, writing her name on the form with slow, careful letters like he wasn't sure he was doing her a favor. She thought about the library, about Cassandra, who had brought her water. What do I do now, she said. Petra had clearly been thinking about this. Several things, in a specific order. First, we complete the legal documentation and establish your ownership formally and completely. Second, we decide what to do with the objects, which means deciding what you want, not what anyone else wants for you. Do you want to sell? Donate? Create some combination? There are tax implications. There are institutional implications. There are implications for how the objects are preserved and accessed going forward. None of these decisions need to be made immediately, but they need to be made thoughtfully. She paused. Third, and this is the one I want you to think about most carefully, we decide how this story gets told. Because it will be told. By you, ideally. And the way you tell it matters for what comes after. Nora thought about that for a long moment. You said people will look at me and decide I shouldn't have this, she said. People with money and credentials and the right backgrounds. Some of them, Petra said. Yes. What do you say to them? Petra was quiet for a moment. The law says what I say to them. You purchased the property through a legal municipal auction. The objects were within the property. They are yours. She paused. But law and opinion are different things. Opinion will come from a lot of directions. Nora was quiet for a moment. Let it come, she said. Petra looked at her. Are you sure? I spent 20 years being told I didn't have rights to things, Nora said. I can handle opinion. Opinion came faster than either of them had planned. It was Fletcher's fault, inadvertently, though he was sorry about it in the way that only people who didn't intend harm are sorry, which is to say genuinely and without sufficient understanding of the chain of events they'd started. He mentioned to his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Doris, that the young woman who'd bought the Wickfield Tower had found something interesting up in the bell room, and Doris mentioned it to her son who worked at the local paper, and the son, who was 26 and hungry for a story that wasn't city council minutes, made a call to the university's public relations office asking if there was anything to a rumor about a significant discovery at the old clock tower on Garnet Lane. The PR office, which had not been fully briefed on the confidentiality situation, confirmed that the university had been involved in some consultative capacity and suggested he speak with Dr. Lindt. Dr. Lindt, to her credit, called Petra immediately and said she had a journalist asking questions. Petra called Nora. Nora was at the bakery. She took the call in the walk-in cooler, which was the only quiet place, surrounded by bread dough and cold air. How much time do we have, she said. The story runs Friday unless we get in front of it, Petra said. Which means tomorrow. Get in front of it how? You tell it. Your way. Before someone else tells their version of it. Nora stood in the walk-in cooler among the proofing dough and thought about Petra's words from the earlier meeting. The way you tell it matters for what comes after. She had known this was coming. She had known since the day Petra warned her. She had been trying to be ready. Set up the interview, she said. With the local paper first. I want to start local. The journalist's name was Danny O'Say, and he was Fletcher's neighbor Doris's son, which meant that when he arrived at the tower on Thursday morning, he had the particular self-consciousness of someone who knew his lead had come from gossip and was trying to be professional anyway. He was young, earnest, with a recorder and a notepad and questions he'd clearly prepared. Nora had prepared too. She took him through the tower the way she'd walked through it herself, starting at the bottom, explaining the auction, the $420, the warped floor, and the cracked mortar and the library books. She told him about Fletcher, who was standing outside the gate as they went in, watching. She told him about the hollow knock, the smell of old paper. Dr. Lindt. She did not yet tell him the numbers. Petra had advised her to. Let those emerge through official channels, through the institutions, through proper documentation. What she told him was the shape of the story, the sequence of it, the texture. The auction notice on a window on Dern Avenue. A library card. A building nobody wanted. The story ran on Friday with a photograph of Nora standing outside the gate of the Wickfield Clocktower, her key in the lock, the 4 frozen clock faces visible above her. The headline was Homeless at 20. She bought an old clock tower for $420. What she found inside has experts calling it extraordinary. The story was careful, Danny having listened when she asked him to be careful. It mentioned the discovery without the specific valuations. It described the objects as historically significant. It quoted Dr. Lindt on the Barbizon painting and Dr. Rhodes on the manuscript in terms that were accurate without being sensational. It was shared 400 times by Friday afternoon. By Saturday, it had been picked up by the state wire service. By Sunday, it was in 3 national outlets. By Monday, Petra had 17 media requests on Nora's behalf and 2 formal inquiries from institutions, 1 museum in Boston and 1 overseas, asking to be considered as potential stewards of the collection. Nora read about herself in the articles the way you read about a person you know well, but whose story looks different in print, flattened and simplified. The details that mattered most to you either absent or buried under the details the story needed to work for people who didn't know you. She read a description of herself as a young woman with no background in art or history who stumbled upon a fortune. She read a description of the tower as a crumbling ruin. She read a quote from a professor at a different university, unnamed, who said the discovery raised important questions about the appropriate stewardship of cultural objects found by private individuals. She read that last sentence 3 times. The appropriate stewardship. Important questions. Private individuals. She called Petra. I saw it, Petra said. What does that mean for us? Nothing legal. Significant amounts of noise. A pause. There will be more of it. Academic communities have strong feelings about objects like yours and where they belong. Some people will make arguments about public access and institutional preservation that are genuine and made in good faith. Others will dress self-interest in the language of principle. Learning to tell the difference is part of what comes next. How do I tell the difference? Nora said. Ask them what they're offering you in return, Petra said. The genuine ones will have thought about that. The others will tell you the objects are too important to be about money. Nora thought about this. The objects are too important to be about money. Which is another way of saying their importance means your interests don't count, Petra said. She heard it then, the same logic that had been applied to her entire life. Your situation is too extreme for your needs to matter. Your circumstances are too hard for your rights to apply. The importance of the thing outweighs the importance of the person who has it. She had heard it in different forms from different mouths for 20 years, and she knew it by its grammar, now even when it came dressed in academic language. She went to the tower. The morning after the first national pickup, she let herself in through the gate and climbed to the bell room and stood near the wall in her usual place and looked at the alcove panel. The objects were still there. Nothing had moved. The seal that Petra had arranged, a formal legal notice affixed to the alcove panel, was in place. Everything was exactly as it had been. She looked at the bell. She thought about Aldous Wickfield, a watchmaker who had known the value of precise instruments and quiet preservation, who had built the highest room in his building as a place to keep what mattered, and then sealed it so well that it had survived not just his death, but a century of neglect, 2 changes of ownership, and 30 years of the city walking past it without looking twice. He had trusted the building to hold. The building had held. She thought about what he would make of a 20-year-old woman standing in his bell room in a coat 1 season too thin with a legal notice on his alcove and her name in national news outlets. She thought he would probably have found it fitting, in his watchmaker's way, that the mechanism had finally tripped, that the thing sealed in the highest room had finally been found, and that it had been found by someone who had needed it precisely when they found it. The bell hung above her, green and silent, suspended on chains that were older than anyone alive. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back downstairs, took out her notepad, and started writing the list she had been avoiding writing, which was what she wanted to do with what she had. Not what Petra advised, not what the institutions were asking for, not what the unnamed professor thought was appropriate. What she wanted, what felt right, what the coal heat in her chest, transformed over weeks into something steadier and warmer and more her own, was telling her. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she had a list that was not long, but was specific, which was the only kind of list she had ever trusted. She put her notepad in her backpack and she walked out of the tower and locked the gate behind her, and she went to find Fletcher. He was in his front garden 2 streets over, doing something to a rose bush that involved more force than the rose bush seemed to require, his breath visible in the December cold. "Can I talk to you?" Nora said. "You're talking," he said, without stopping. "I've figured out what I want to do." Fletcher stopped. He looked at her with the attention he'd given the bell room floor the first time, testing, reading. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. Not the numbers, Not yet, though he had a sense of them by now from the news coverage. She told him the shape of the decision, what she was going to sell, and to whom and on what terms. What she was going to keep, what she was going to do with the money, some of it, the part that was already clear in her mind. Fletcher listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. That's a lot, he said. I know. You sure? No, she said. But I think the not being sure is part of it. I think if I were completely sure it would mean I wasn't taking it seriously enough. Fletcher looked at her with something that might have been pride, though she wasn't sure she'd had enough experience with it to recognize it reliably. Your mother would have liked you, he said. Nora blinked. You didn't know my mother. No, he said. But the way you talk, you had to come from somewhere. He picked up his pruning shears and went back to the rose bush. Go do what you're going to do. She went. She called Petra first and told her. Then she called Dr. Lindt. Then she called Dr. Rhodes's office in England and left a message and waited. And when Dr. Rhodes called back, Nora explained what she'd decided about the manuscript. And there was a long silence on the line. And then Dr. Rhodes said, in a voice that was controlled in a different way than before, a control that was keeping something back that was not professional detachment. That is extraordinarily generous. It has conditions, Nora said. Of course, Dr. Rhodes said. Nora laid out the conditions. They were specific and non-negotiable and had been thought about carefully, and Petra had reviewed them and said they were legally sound. Dr. Rhodes agreed to them without hesitation, which confirmed something Nora had suspected about her. Then she went back to the shelter. It was a Tuesday evening, the last Tuesday before Christmas, and the shelter was warm and smelled of the dinner they'd served, something with tomatoes, and the long table was full of women at different stages of the lives they were living here. Dolores was at her usual spot. Priya was at the far end, reading something. Nora sat down across from Dolores, and Dolores looked at her and said, You look different. I made some decisions, Nora said. Good decisions? I think so. Dolores nodded. You still coming back here at night? For now, Nora said. Until the building is livable. How long? Nora looked around the table. At the women here, at the particular texture of this place that she had resented and needed in equal measure for 11 months. At Priya at the far end. A few months, she said. Maybe less. Dolores looked at her steadily. You're going to be okay, she said. Not a question. Yes, Nora said. I am. She meant it. For the first time and longer than she could remember, she meant it with the full weight of the word, not as reassurance or performance or desperate optimism, but as a plain factual statement about the state of things. She was going to be okay. The world had not finished with her yet, and she had not finished with it. And the building at the end of Garnet Lane with its 4 frozen clock faces and its hidden alcove and its century of patient keeping was hers, and the things inside it were hers, and the decisions about what to do with them were hers, and she had made them. She ate the dinner. She went to her cot. She lay in the dark and listened to Dolores sleep. Outside, the Wickfield Clocktower stood at the end of Garnet Lane, its stone dark in the December night, its clock faces still frozen at 3:11. But inside the bell room, in the alcove behind the wooden panel, a book 600 years old waited in its carefully maintained dark, and a painting from a century ago waited in its frame, and coins from the Roman Empire waited in their boxes, and a leather satchel sat clasped and patient. All of it waiting for what came next. All of it hers. The formal public announcement came on a Thursday in January, 2 weeks into the new year, in the form of a joint press release from Petra's office, the university, and the 2 institutions Nora had chosen to work with. Petra had drafted the language, and Nora had revised it twice, not for legal reasons, but because the first 2 drafts didn't sound like her, and she had decided that the way this was told would sound like her, or it would not be told by her at all. The final release was direct. A young woman named Nora Voss, age 20, had purchased a decommissioned municipal property at public auction in March of the previous year. During renovation work, she had discovered a sealed alcove in the building's bell room containing objects assembled by the tower's original owner, Aldous Wickfield, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The collection had been professionally assessed by specialists from multiple institutions. It included significant works of art, historical artifacts, numismatic items, and a medieval manuscript of exceptional rarity and scholarly importance. The total assessed value of the collection was between $6 and $14 million. The release outlined Nora's decisions regarding the collection, stated plainly, In the order she had written them in her notepad in the ground floor of the tower on the morning she figured out what she wanted. The medieval manuscript would be donated to the university on permanent loan to be housed in a dedicated reading room accessible to scholars, open to the public on a scheduled basis. The donation came with conditions. The room would be named the Wickfield Room in honor of the man who had kept it. Access would remain free of charge, and the university would provide an annual scholarship for students from the foster care system in Halverton County, funded in perpetuity by an endowment established from a portion of the donation's tax benefit. The Barbizon painting would be sold at auction. The proceeds, after legal fees and taxes, would be used to purchase and renovate the Wickfield Clocktower, which Nora intended to make into a livable home, and to establish a small foundation whose purpose she described in the press release in plain language: to provide first and last month rent deposits for people leaving the shelter system in Halverton, so that the gap between a shelter cot and a stable address would be one someone could cross. The coins, the ceramics, and the smaller objects would be sold through appropriate specialist channels. A portion of those proceeds would go to Nora Voss personally. The press release stated this without apology. Nora had insisted on that. She deserved it. She had bought something nobody wanted with the last of what she had, and she had protected it and thought about it carefully and made decisions that took everyone into account. She had earned the right to be secure. The press release went out at 9 in the morning. By noon it had been picked up by every outlet that had covered the original story and several that hadn't. By 3 in the afternoon, Petra's phone had received 47 media requests. By 5, 2 television networks had reached out about documentary interest. And in between all of that, at 11:30 in the morning, a phone call came that Nora had not expected. The number was a local one. She answered. "Is this Nora Voss?" A man's voice, older, slightly rough. "Yes. My name is Corbett Hale. We met at an auction about 10 months ago. You outbid me on a clock tower." Nora was quiet for a moment. She remembered him. The man in his 70s who had bid $400 and then looked at her and shaken his head and walked away. "I remember you," she said. "I've been reading about what you found," Corbett Hale said. "I wanted to call because I owe you something." "What's that?" Nora said. A pause. "I shook my head when you raised my bid. You saw that?" "I saw it," she said. "I wasn't shaking my head at you," he said. "I was shaking my head at myself. I'd looked at that tower a dozen times over the years, and I never went inside. Never made the appointment. I thought it was too far gone to be worth the trouble." Another pause, longer. "You went inside." "I did," Nora said. "I just wanted you to know that the shake of my head wasn't what it might have looked like," he said. "You deserved what you found. I hope it does well for you." He hung up. Nora stood in the ground floor of the tower, where she'd taken the call, and looked at the warped floor and the cracked mortar and the narrow windows and the iron staircase. The winter light came through the east window and did what it always did to the stone at this hour, made it look like amber. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the staircase rising into the dark above. She had work to do. The renovation started in February, on the coldest week of the year, which felt appropriate to Nora in a way she couldn't fully explain except to say that she had learned most of the important things in her life during cold weather, and she saw no reason to stop now. She hired Fletcher first. Not out of sentiment, though sentiment was part of it, but because he was the most competent person she knew in relation to the tower, and because he had walked into the gate uninvited on a November afternoon with a folding ruler and looked at the building the way it deserved to be looked at, which was honestly and without illusion. She offered him a fair rate, slightly above market, and he looked at the number she wrote on the paper and said it was too much, and she said it wasn't, and he said he supposed she would know, and they shook hands. And that was that. He brought in 2 other contractors he trusted, men he'd worked with over 30 years whose names were Carl and Domingo, and together the 4 of them spent the first week doing what Fletcher called a proper reckoning, which meant going through every inch of the building with the specific attention of people who intended to fix what they found rather than catalog it for someone else's problem. They pulled up sections of the warped floor and examined the joists. They probed the cracked mortar with tools and found it worse in some places than it looked and better in others. They assessed the iron staircase, which turned out to be in extraordinary condition, the 19th century metalwork needing only cleaning and a small amount of reinforcement at 2 joints. They went up to the bell room and reinforced the floor properly, the way it should have been done in 1994 when the report first recommended it. Nora was there every day. She did what she could do and was honest about what she couldn't, which turned out to be a useful quality in a renovation context because the people around her spent less time managing her expectations and more time teaching her things. Carl showed her how to mix mortar correctly, the consistency that held without crumbling, the ratio that matched the original work closely enough to be honest without pretending it was something it wasn't. Domingo showed her how to read a joist for stress, where the grain ran, and what it told you about load-bearing capacity. Fletcher showed her everything else, methodically and without condescension, in the same register he'd used when he first showed her how to test the bellroom floor. She worked alongside them in the mornings and handled the administrative work in the afternoons, sitting in the ground floor on a folding chair with her laptop open, managing the processes that Petra had set in motion. The auction for the Barbizon painting had been scheduled through a specialist house in New York, the kind that handled 19th-century European works and had the client base to justify a serious sale. Petra was managing the coin and ceramic sales through two separate specialist dealers, one numismatic and one antiquities, each chosen for their track record with authenticated material and their straightforward approach to transparent pricing. The Tang Dynasty figure and the Greek vessel, once properly documented and listed with full provenance, attracted institutional interest within days of being offered. Museums were careful buyers, slow and procedural, but they paid fair prices for things they could properly document, and Aldous Wickfield's ledger made documentation a matter of presenting records rather than constructing arguments. The Greek vessel went to a museum in Chicago. The Tang figure went to a university collection in California. Each sale came with a public acknowledgement in the institution's acquisition records, citing Nora Voss as the seller and the Wickfield collection as the source, which was not something she had required, but which both institutions had done as a matter of practice, and which she was glad of. The Barbizon painting sold at auction on a Thursday evening in March. Nora watched it on a live stream on her laptop in the ground floor of the tower, sitting on the folding chair with Fletcher beside her on a crate, both of them in work clothes with plaster dust still on their jackets. The auctioneer's voice was smooth and procedural, the way auction voices always were, reading numbers into a room Nora could see on the screen, but not hear except through the filtered audio, paddles rising and falling. The painting sold for considerably more than the low end of the conservator's range. It sold for slightly above the midpoint. The number appeared on screen in the clean font of auction house software, and Nora looked at it, and Fletcher made a sound that was not quite a word. She called Petra from outside the gate, standing in the March cold, her breath visible. "I saw," Petra said. "Congratulations. Is that the right word?" Nora said. "I don't know what the right word is," Petra said. "But it's a good number." It was a good number. After the auction house commission and the taxes, which Petra had prepared her for carefully and which were significant but not surprising, the net was enough to complete the tower renovation with money remaining for the foundation's initial endowment. The foundation's name, which Nora had thought about for longer than she'd thought about most things, was the Garnet Lane Foundation. Simple and local. She didn't want it named after her. She didn't want anything named after her except the life she was building. The Garnet Lane Foundation's purpose, as written in its founding documents, and as Petra had helped her think through with the same careful precision she brought to everything, was specific: to provide first and last month rent deposits, up to a defined amount, for individuals and families transitioning out of emergency housing in Halverton County. Not a loan, not a conditional grant. A deposit paid directly to a landlord, removing the single most common barrier between a shelter and a stable address. The gap Nora had lived in. The gap she knew the exact dimensions of from the inside. The board of the foundation was small. Petra as legal advisor. Dr. Lindt, who had agreed immediately. A woman named Rosaria, who ran the intake desk at the Caldwell Street shelter, and who Nora had spoken to every week for almost a year without either of them knowing this was where they were going. And Fletcher, who said he didn't know anything about running a foundation, and Nora said she didn't either, and they were probably both going to learn. Rosaria cried when Nora told her. Not in front of Nora, which Nora found out about later, but in the back office of the shelter, where she sat for 20 minutes after the meeting before going back to the intake desk. She told Nora this herself, weeks later, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has decided that pretending not to feel things is a waste of time they don't have. I see a lot of people walk out of here, Rosaria said. Most of them I worry about. I worried about, and then I stopped worrying. When did you stop? Nora said. Rosaria thought about it. About the second week. You had a quality. What quality? You were angry, but you weren't broken, Rosaria said. Those are different things. Broken people can't use their anger. You were using yours every single day. Nora thought about that for a long time afterward. The renovation took 5 months in total, running from February through the end of June. It was not a fast renovation because they were not doing a fast renovation. They were doing it correctly, which meant doing it in the order things needed to be done in, which meant some weeks looked like very little progress and other weeks looked like sudden transformation. Nora had accepted this from the library books before the first hammer swung, and it served her well when Fletcher told her on a Tuesday in April that the third floor would need to be completely refloored, which was 2 weeks of work she hadn't budgeted and a number she had to move from one column to another, and which was fine. It was fine. She had room. She had done the arithmetic. The ground floor became the kitchen and living area. The second floor became a workspace, a desk and bookshelves, and the kind of practical comfort that Nora had spent enough time without to know exactly what it required and what it didn't. The third floor became her bedroom, with the east-facing window that caught the morning light she had loved from the first week, the amber light on old stone that she had known, without being able to say why, was something she needed to live near. The fourth floor, the bellroom, she left mostly as it was. The floor was reinforced and clean. The wooden panel with its alcove was intact, empty now, its shelves bare, but present, the latch still functional, the hinges still smooth. She put nothing in it. It felt important to leave it as it was, an absence where a presence had been, a space that had done its job and was now resting. The bell still hung in its chains above. She had considered having it taken down, but decided against it for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, except that the bell had been there since 1887 and had hung through everything that had happened in that room and seemed like something that should be allowed to stay. She had a bell ringer come in the spring to look at the mechanism, an old craft, harder to find a practitioner of than she'd expected. The woman who came, in her 60s with the look of someone who had spent her life doing things most people didn't know were still done, examined the mechanism for 2 hours and told Nora it was reparable. The original clockwork was beyond economic recovery, she said, but the bell itself could ring again with a simple modern actuator, nothing visible from outside, nothing that changed the appearance of the room. Just a mechanism that would allow the bell to move and sound at an interval of Nora's choosing. Nora chose once a day, at noon, which was not 3, which was where the clock faces were frozen, but which was close enough to feel like a conversation between the building's past and its present. She kept the clock faces frozen. She could have had them repaired. She chose not to. The frozen hands at 3 were part of what the building was. You didn't fix things just because you could. The bell rang for the first time on June 30th, a Tuesday, at noon, and Fletcher and Carl and Domingo were on the ground floor having lunch, and they all stopped and looked up, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Carl said, quietly, "There it is," and went back to his sandwich. Nora moved in on July 4th, not for any symbolic reason, but because that was the first day the building was ready for occupancy as certified by the inspector, and she had been sleeping on her friend Kezia's couch for 6 weeks by then, having left the shelter in mid-May when Priya, who had aged out at 18, needed the cot more than she did. She moved in with the things she had, which were not many. The backpack, now worn soft at the straps. Clothes that were better than they'd been, but not extravagant. She was not interested in extravagance as a concept, though. She was interested in warmth and quality, which she was learning were not the same as expensive. Books, more than she'd started with, accumulated from the library book sales that happened twice a year, where you could fill a bag for $3. A cast iron pan she had bought secondhand because Fletcher told her it was the only pan worth having. A blanket that had belonged to her mother, saved from the apartment, carried through every room and cot since she was 17, slightly worn at one corner in the specific way that things were when they've been held. She carried these things up the spiral staircase to the third floor on a warm July morning with the windows open and the city audible below and the east light doing what it always did at that hour, and she set them down in the room that was hers and stood in the middle of it and breathed. She had a home, not a room in someone else's place, not a cot in a shelter, not a couch she was grateful for, but not her own. A home. For stories of 1887 limestone with a repaired floor and cleaned mortar and an iron staircase, and a bell that rang at noon and 4 clock faces frozen at 11 past 3 and a bell room at the top that smelled, faintly but persistently, of old paper and old bronze. She stood in the room and breathed and let herself feel it. It was not what she had imagined, when she had allowed herself to imagine, which had not been often because the imagining hurt too much when the reality was too far from it. What she had imagined had been generic, the way you imagine things you've never had, assembled from images seen in other people's lives, rooms and movies, houses and books. What she had was specific and strange and entirely her own. A circular room in a tower on a street corner in a city that had not known she existed until she bought something it was trying to get rid of. She sat down on the floor, her back against the curved stone wall, the window to her east, the city below, the light coming in. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry, though she was aware that crying was available to her if she wanted it. She chose instead to just sit in the fact of it, in the weight and the warmth of being somewhere she had put herself, somewhere that would not disappear in 60 days. When the bell rang at noon, she felt it through the stone wall at her back, a vibration that moved through the whole building from top to bottom. And she put her hand flat on the wall and felt it pass through her. And that was when she cried, quietly and completely, for about 4 minutes. And then she stopped and wiped her face and stood up and went downstairs to make lunch in her kitchen. The Wickfield room opened on a September morning, a Thursday, with the particular ceremonial quality of university events, which is to say it was formal and also slightly awkward and involved a ribbon that was too thick for the scissors. Nora stood in the front row, next to Dr. Lindt and Dr. Rhodes, who had flown in from England for the occasion, and the university's president made a speech that was gracious and accurate and described Nora as a young woman of extraordinary character and remarkable generosity, which was true but felt like being looked at from a great distance. The Wickfield room was on the second floor of the university library's special collections wing. It was small by institutional standards, designed for the careful handling of objects rather than the accommodation of large groups, with adjustable lighting and climate control and a reading table large enough for scholars to work properly. The Book of Hours was housed in a case at the center of the room, open to a page that Marcus had chosen with Dr. Rhodes, a full-page miniature of particular beauty, one of the 12, showing a scene in colors that had survived 6 centuries and a sealed alcove and the journey from a European atelier to a Flemish buyer to a Paris dealer to a watchmaker in Colorado to a university reading room where people could now sit and look at it on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 10 and 4. The plaque on the wall of the Wickfield room read, "This collection was assembled by Aldous Wickfield, 1851 to 1921, watchmaker and private collector, and preserved in the Wickfield Clocktower, 14, Garnet Lane, Halverton, for over a century. It was discovered in 2024 by Nora Voss, who purchased the tower and chose to ensure that this manuscript would remain accessible to scholars and the public in perpetuity." Nora had written the last sentence herself. Petra had asked if she was sure she wanted her name on it, and Nora had said yes, because the story mattered, and leaving her out of the story would make it incomplete in a way that served nobody. Not her, and not anyone who came after her and needed to know that a 20-year-old with a library card and $420 could find something that changed everything. After the ceremony, there was a small reception with coffee and the university's particular brand of institutional pastry, dry but earnest, and Nora moved through it with the combination of ease and slight discomfort she was developing for public occasions, the ease coming from having survived harder things than small talk, the discomfort coming from the fact that small talk was still small talk. Dr. Rhodes found her near the window and stood beside her and looked out at the university's autumn trees, the maples starting to turn, and said nothing for a moment. "How are you finding it?" she said eventually. "What part?" Nora said. "All of it. The past 6 months." Nora considered. "Like learning a language," she said. "The grammar keeps surprising me." Dr. Rhodes looked at her. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what it's like." They stood together and looked at the turning trees and drank the university coffee and said nothing more, which was comfortable in the way that standing beside people who understand you is comfortable. Dr. Lindt came to find her before the end of the reception and pulled her slightly aside with the manner of someone who had something to say that required a little separation from the general noise. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Dr. Lindt said, "and you can tell me it's none of my business." "Go ahead," Nora said. "Why the scholarship?" "For foster care students specifically. You could have attached any condition to the donation. That was the condition you chose." Nora looked at her for a moment. "Because someone should have done it for me," she said. "Because I had to do everything harder than it needed to be, because nobody had thought to make it easier. And I had the chance to change that for somebody, so I did." Dr. Lindt looked at her steadily. "The first recipient was named last week," she said. "I thought you should know, if you don't already. A girl from the county foster system. 18. She wants to study archaeology." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. Then, after a beat, "Tell her about Aldous Wickfield." Dr. Lindt smiled. "I will." The Garnet Lane Foundation made its first grants in October. Rosaria processed them from the shelter's intake desk, working with Petra's office to verify eligibility and coordinate with landlords, and the first 3 went to families, 2 of them with children, who had been in the shelter system for between 4 and 9 months, and who had jobs and references, and every practical qualification for stable housing except the deposit that the first month always required. Nora was not present for any of the individual handovers. She had made a deliberate decision about that, which was that the Foundation's work was not about her being present to witness it, not about the emotional experience of watching the thing she'd set in motion produce its effect. It was about the effect, the families, the landlords accepting deposits, the doors that opened. She did not need to watch it to know it was happening, and knowing it was happening was sufficient. She told Fletcher this one evening in October, when he came by the tower for the dinner she'd started cooking on Sundays and occasionally inviting him to, because he lived alone and she cooked better than he did by this point, which was a fact they both accepted without ceremony. "You could go," he said. "They wouldn't think less of you." "I know," she said. "That's not why." "Then why?" "Because it's not a performance," she said. "It's just something that needed doing, and I did it. I don't need to be there for it to be real." Fletcher looked at her over the cast iron pan with the expression he sometimes had of a man who is impressed but has decided not to say so directly. "You're an unusual person," he said. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't entirely a compliment. "I know," she said. "I took it as one anyway." She was, by October, almost a year out from the auction, and the quality of her daily life had changed in ways that were both large and small, and the small ones mattered as much as the large ones. She slept in a bed in a circular room with a window that caught the morning light. She had enough to eat. She was not cold. These were not small things in themselves. She refused to treat them as small, but they were the foundation of the larger things in the way that foundations always were, invisible and necessary. She had enrolled at the community college in September. Not full-time, not with any particular urgency, but with the specific intention of someone who had spent a year learning that curiosity was not a luxury, but a requirement of being alive in the way she wanted to be alive. She was taking 2 courses. One was a survey of art history, which she had chosen for obvious reasons, and one was a course in property law, which she had chosen because the past year had made clear that understanding how ownership worked was not a specialized knowledge but a basic literacy that she had been denied access to and intended to acquire. The art history professor, a man named Dr. Petrov who wore the same brown cardigan to every class and who clearly loved what he taught with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who had never doubted their vocation, spent 3 weeks on the Barbizon School in October. He showed slides of landscapes, forests, light through trees, the particular quality of attention to the natural world that defined the tradition. He mentioned, in passing, that a Barbizon painting had sold at auction in New York the previous spring for a number that had surprised the market. Nora sat in the 3rd row and said nothing. After class, she stayed to ask him a question about the Barbizon artist's relationship with their patrons, a question that was genuine, and that led to a conversation that ran 20 minutes past the end of the hour. And when it was over, Dr. Petrov looked at her and said, "You know more about this than most students. Have you studied it before?" "In a way," Nora said. She did not elaborate. She thanked him and picked up her bag and walked out into the October afternoon and went home to the tower, where the bell had already rung at noon and the city was going about its business, and the east window caught the late afternoon light in the way it did in October, lower and more golden than it had been in July, the stone warmer looking even as the air outside went cold again. She climbed to the bell room. She did this most evenings, not always, but often enough that it had become a kind of practice, a daily maintenance of something she didn't have an exact name for. She would stand near the wall and look at the alcove panel and think about Aldous Wickfield, and she would look at the bell and think about time, and she would look through the louvers at whatever the city was doing, lit up or gray, clear or clouded, and she would let herself be in the place she was in without needing it to be anything other than what it was. Tonight she carried a book up with her, the art history textbook, flagged at the Barbizon chapter. She sat on the floor near the wall, the curved stone at her back, and read by the last of the daylight coming through the louvers, the same narrow bars of light that had been coming through those same louvers for 137 years, falling on different things now, but themselves unchanged. She read until the light was gone, and then she sat in the dark and listened to the city below and felt the building around her, the thickness of the walls, the weight of the stone, the particular silence of a structure that had been standing long enough to develop a character, its own way of holding and deflecting sound, its own thermal logic, warm in its cold way in the winter and cool in its warm way in the summer, and always, at every hour, certain. She had needed certainty. She had learned that about herself over the past year in the way you learn things that were always true, but that circumstances hadn't allowed you to know. She needed something that held still long enough to be known. That was what the tower had given her before it gave her anything else, before the alcove and the manuscript and the foundation and the scholarship and the bell ringing at noon. It had given her something that held still. She sat in the bell room in the dark and understood that she was grateful. Not in the performed way that people say they're grateful when they're actually just relieved, but in the larger, quieter way, grateful the way you're grateful for breath, for the particular stubborn persistence of being alive in a world that had tried several times to convince her it didn't need her here. It did need her here. She had proven that in the only way it could be proven, by staying and doing something. November came and the tower was cold in the way that old stone buildings were cold in November, which was thoroughgoing and required a respect for wool and warm socks, and the cast iron radiator she'd had installed on the second floor that knocked pleasantly when the heat came up in the morning. She had put a proper heating system through the building, but she'd been advised by the historic preservation consultant she'd brought in that the stone itself, if the envelope was intact, would hold heat better than most modern materials once it was properly warmed, which turned out to be true, and which she found pleasing in a deep way that had to do with the building's integrity, its wholeness. The fact that what Aldous Wickfield had built correctly in 1887 was still doing correctly what it had been built to do. The anniversary of the auction was March 14th. She had been thinking about it since January, in the ambient way you think about dates that matter, and when it arrived it was a Tuesday again, cold and clear, the sky that particular shade of pale blue that came before sunrise on days when the air had been scrubbed clean overnight. She was at the bakery by 5, same as always, and she pulled croissants from the oven at 7 and thought about the morning a year ago when she had stood outside the municipal office and read a notice on a window and done the math. At noon the bell rang. She was in the kitchen on the ground floor, and she felt it through the floor and the walls, the building speaking in the only voice it had, and she stood still and let it ring, and then she put her coat on and went outside and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the 4 clock faces. Frozen at 3:11. The same. She thought about what 3:11 meant to a watchmaker. Not 3 o'clock, the clean hour. Not half past, the recognized interval. 11 minutes past, which was nobody's landmark, which was just a moment in the movement of a mechanism that had stopped mid-motion and been preserved exactly there, a minute and a second captured and held. She had bought a book on horology in the fall, The Science of Timekeeping, because it seemed right to understand the field that had built this building. The book explained that clocks stopped for many reasons, mechanical failure being the most common, but that when they stopped at whatever moment the failure occurred, which could be any moment at all, and that the stop time was not meaningful in itself. It only meant, this is when it ended. But she thought there was another way to look at it. 3:11 was not when something ended. It was when something paused. The mechanism had failed, but the building had not. The walls had not. The bell room had not. The alcove with its sealed contents had not. Everything that mattered had continued, just without sound, without visible motion, held in the dark until someone came to listen. She was still looking at the clock faces when Fletcher came around the corner with his hands in his jacket pockets. "Anniversary," he said. "Yes," she said. "How does it feel?" She thought about that honestly, because Fletcher was the kind of person who asked honest questions and expected honest answers, and she had learned to give them. "Like I'm still at the beginning," she said. "But a beginning with walls and a floor and a functioning heating system." Fletcher made a sound that was his version of a laugh. "That's the good kind," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood on the sidewalk together for a while, looking up at the building. The pale blue sky was brightening behind it, the sun still below the roof line, the clock tower dark against the light. "You know what I think about?" Fletcher said. "What?" "The auction. The moment you raised my neighbor's bid." He paused. "You were 20 years old with how much money in total?" $712, she said. "And some change." He shook his head. "And you looked at that tower, and you thought, that's the one." "I thought it was the only thing I could afford," she said. "No," Fletcher said, with the certainty of a man who had been watching closely for a year. "You thought it was the right thing. Those are different." She didn't argue. She thought he was probably right, in the way he was right about foundations and joists and mortar ratios, from experience and attention rather than theory. The Garnet Lane Foundation had made 19 grants by the anniversary. 19 families or individuals who had moved from the shelter system into stable housing with the deposit gap bridged. Rosaria sent Nora a report each month, factual and precise, the kind of document that didn't dress things up because it didn't need to. Names were not included, privacy being a thing the foundation protected seriously. The report listed amounts disbursed, dates, and a one-line description. Family of 3, permanent housing secured. Single adult, studio apartment, employed. Woman with 2 children, 12-month lease signed. Nora read each report the same way she read everything that mattered, slowly and completely, and she kept them in a folder on the second floor of the tower alongside the authentication reports and Petra's legal documents and the notes she had made on the ground floor on the morning she figured out what she wanted. That morning felt like a long time ago now and also like yesterday, which was the quality of significant moments. She was learning that they compressed and expanded depending on how you approach them. She had told the story in full once at the university, invited to speak to a class of graduate students in art history and library science in November. Dr. Lindt had arranged it and Nora had agreed after some consideration, because the academic context felt right, because these were people who would understand the specific nature of what had been found in the alcove and would be interested in it for the right reasons. She had stood in front of 20 graduate students and a professor, and she had told the full story from the beginning. The same story she had told Danny Osei for the local paper, but longer and with the parts left out of the public version restored. The $712. The folding ruler and the hollow knock. The smell of old paper. The decision not to open the boxes immediately, to wait, to do it properly. A student near the back had asked why she had waited, why she hadn't opened everything right away. Nora had thought about that for a moment before answering. "Because I knew it mattered," she said. "And when something matters, you don't rush it. You make sure the conditions are right before you touch it. You find the people who know how to handle it properly. You don't let urgency damage what deserves care." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the professor, an older man with the look of someone who had heard many presentations, said, "That's the definition of conservation ethics, stated better than most textbook definitions I've encountered." Nora had not known that. She had just known it from the inside. The story was in 3 archives now, or versions of it were. The legal documents in Petra's office, the Wickfield room's public record at the university, and the camera footage that Danny Osei had taken on the day of the original interview, which he had edited into a short documentary that had found a modest audience online, and which Nora had watched once and decided was a fair representation of something that was difficult to represent fairly. In the documentary, there was a shot of her standing outside the gate with the key in the lock, the one that had run with the original article. She had seen it many times by now, the image of herself that existed in the public record, and she had made her peace with it, the way you made peace with the version of yourself that other people carried, which was never quite the full thing, but could be honest if the person making it had been paying attention. Danny had been paying attention. The documentary had a moment near the end where he'd asked her what she would say to Aldous Wickfield if she could. She had thought about that for a long moment on camera, a silence that he had kept in the edit rather than cutting, and then she had said, Thank you for building it right. Thank you for trusting that someone would come. She meant it. She still meant it. She climbed to the bell room on the anniversary evening. As the city went dark below, the lights coming on in the buildings, she could see through the louvers, the river catching the last of the western sky. She stood near the wall, her hand on the stone, and looked at the alcove panel. She had put something in it. Not filling it, not replacing what had been there, but something small that belonged. She had put it in 2 weeks ago, on a quiet evening, without ceremony. A copy of Aldous Wickfield's acquisition ledger, printed by the university archivist on archival paper, the same kind of paper that had preserved his original. A photograph of the Wickfield room, the manuscript in its case, the plaque on the wall with both their names. A list of the 19 families. Not their names, not their stories, just the number and the date and the fact, 19. And a note, handwritten, in the clear plain script she had developed from years of writing things down in library margins and notebook pages with the specific intention of being understood. The note said, "Someone found what you kept. She tried to do what you would have wanted. She thinks she mostly succeeded. The building is good." The bell rings. She pulled the panel latch closed. The mechanism was smooth, the hinges barely whispering. The panel settled back into its ordinary-looking position, holding its counsel. She looked at the bell above her. Green bronze, suspended in the dark, patient. She thought about what Rosaria had said. You were angry, but you weren't broken. She thought about those as two separate things, anger and brokenness, and the specific difference between them, which was that anger still believed the world could be different and brokenness had stopped believing. She had never stopped believing. It had cost her things, that believing, because believing in the world required staying present to it even when it was painful, and staying present to things that were painful was not easy. It was the opposite of easy. It was the hardest ongoing project of being alive. But she had done it. She was doing it. And standing in the bell room of the building she owned, on the anniversary of the day she had bought it with the last of what she had, because it was the only thing she could afford, and because it was hers, and because nobody else wanted it, she understood something she had been approaching for months without quite arriving at. She had not been lucky. Or she had been lucky. Yes, in the way all human lives are lucky, the random kindnesses of timing and proximity and the specific chain of events that put a person in the right place at the right moment. She had been lucky the way Aldous Wickfield had been lucky to arrive in Halverton in 1870 when precision instruments were a growth industry, the way the watchmaker's gift for accuracy had found its market. Luck was always part of it. But luck was not the story. Luck was the door. What you did when the door opened, that was the story. And she had done everything you were supposed to do when a door opened that you had not expected. She had walked through it carefully. She had looked at what she found rather than assuming she knew what it was. She had gotten the people she needed. She had been patient when patience was called for and decisive when decisions were needed. And she had thought about what it meant rather than just what it was worth. That was not luck. That was her. The person she had spent 20 years becoming through the specific hard school of not having enough. Through the angry patience of someone who knows that the world is capable of more than it is currently delivering and intends to make it deliver. She stood in the bell room and breathed. Tomorrow the bell would ring at noon. The east window would do what it always did to the light. The stone walls would hold. The scholarship student in the archaeology program would go to her first class. The 20th family, whoever they were, would put their key in the lock of a door that was going to hold for more than 60 days. She would go to the bakery in the morning and make croissants and come home to the tower and read the art history textbook in the amber light, and in the evening climb to the bell room and stand with her hand on the stone and think about watchmakers and medieval manuscripts and the specific quality of things preserved long enough to matter. She would be okay. She was okay. She had been okay, in the deep sense, for longer than she'd let herself admit, and the admitting of it now, here, in this room, felt like a completion of something that had started the morning she stood outside the municipal office and read a notice on a window. She was 21 years old. She owned a clock tower. She had found something in the highest room that a man who loved precision had sealed inside his life's work over a century ago and trusted to time. She had done what he would have wanted with it. Mostly, she thought, she hoped, as well as she could with what she knew, which was all anyone could do with anything. She looked at the alcove panel one more time. Then she went downstairs, moving through the building floor by floor, running her hand along the iron staircase as she descended, feeling the cold of the metal and the roughness of the stone and the solidity of the repaired wood under her feet. Down through the bell room to the third floor where her books were and the window that caught the morning light. Down to the second floor where the desk sat and the folders were arranged and the cast iron radiator knocked its morning greeting. Down to the ground floor with its sealed mortar and its swept stone and its narrow windows where the evening light still came through at a low angle, warm and amber, the same light it had always been. She stood in the ground floor room and looked around at all of it, at the building that had been decommissioned and forgotten and sold for nothing and found again, and she thought about what it meant to hold something long enough for it to matter. Then she went to make dinner, because she was hungry and it was Tuesday and Fletcher was coming at 7. And life was not only the large things, it was also dinner on a Tuesday, and the cast iron pan heating on the stove, and the bell that would ring tomorrow at noon, and the morning light still coming. Still coming. Always coming. The clock tower stood at the end of Garnet Lane with its 4 frozen faces, and its ringing bell, and its sealed alcove and the woman who lived in it. And it was the same building it had always been, built right, holding still, keeping what mattered, waiting for whoever needed to find it. It had done its job. So had she. She was 20 years old, sleeping on a shelter cot, and she had exactly $712 to her name. Not $712 in savings. Not $712 after bills. $712 in total, in a locked metal box in a shelter office on Caldwell Street, and that was everything. That was the whole sum of what 20 years of living had left her with after the mother who died, and the landlord who didn't wait, and the jobs that cut hours, and the cousins who ran out of room, and the string of shared apartments that came and went until there were no more. Most people in that position look for a way to stretch what they have. A cheaper room. A second job. A plan that keeps the gap from widening. Nora Voss looked at a notice on a government office window and did the math a different way. The notice was for a municipal surplus auction. The property was a decommissioned clock tower on Garnet Lane for stories of blackened 1887 limestone with 4 clock faces frozen at 11 past 3 and a minimum bid of $400. The city's own listing described it as structurally unverified, sold as is, no warranties express or implied. The building had been sitting empty since 1994. Nobody had looked at it seriously in 30 years. Nora made the viewing appointment. What happened next would take almost a year to fully unfold, and when it did, it would move through a university authentication lab, 2 specialist auction houses, an international manuscript expert flown in from England, a lawyer's yellow legal pad, and a foundation whose first 19 grants would change 19 lives in ways that had nothing to do with the woman who made them possible being in the room to watch. But before any of that, there was a building nobody wanted, and a woman with $420 who decided it was hers. The thing about overlooked places is that they don't stay overlooked because there's nothing in them. They stay overlooked because the looking requires something most people decide they don't have. Time. Nerve. The particular kind of stubbornness that reads a disclaimer saying no warranties express or implied and hears, underneath the legal caution, an opening. Aldous Wickfield had built his tower in 1887 as a watchmaker who understood precision the way other people understood breathing, automatically, without having to think about it. He had sealed the highest room with the same care he put into the instruments that measured time down to the second. He had died in 1921 knowing the city would take the building and trusting, in the way that careful people trust things they cannot control, that what he had left behind would find the person meant to find it. He waited 103 years. What Nora Voss found in the bell room of the Wickfield Clocktower on a November afternoon, behind a wooden panel that sounded hollow when a retired contractor knocked his knuckle against it, was not just a collection of objects. It was a question, the same question that gets asked in different forms by every sealed alcove, every locked chest, everything preserved past its keeper's lifetime and left for whoever comes next. Who are you when nobody is watching? What do you do with something that could change your life when the right thing and the easy thing are not the same? Nora Voss answered that question over the course of one of the most extraordinary years in the quiet history of a city that almost sold its past for $400. This is how it happened. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.